Hi, my name is Josh and today I'm going to be talking to you about community re-entry. Community re-entry is when a person is released from prison back into the public. This is something I'm really passionate about. I was released from prison myself a couple of years ago. I've been in and out of prison since my teens, for things like burglary and assault and drug offences. One of the most difficult parts of all of that was coming back into the community after release. And that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. On average, there are around 85,000 people in prisons in the UK, and this number is growing. As well as this, researchers estimate that 95% of prisoners will be released at some point. This means that there will always be ex-offenders coming back into the community. As I mentioned, the first stages after release from prison can be incredibly difficult. So if you think about tens of thousands of people going through such a difficult time, it's easy to see why this is such an important issue. Other than ex-offenders re-entering the community, there are also people on suspended sentences or community sentences. Suspended sentences mean that they have been convicted of a crime, but they haven't been taken into prison yet. This acts as a period of probation. Community sentences are given when offenders are convicted, but not sent to prison. This option is more likely for people with mental health issues or people who have never committed a crime before. All of these people need support within their communities too. They will still have a criminal record, so getting a job or maintaining a stable lifestyle becomes more difficult. But similar problems occur as with ex-prisoners. Most people choose not to interact with them. This only increases the likelihood that they will re-offend and be sent back to prison. So as I said, prisoners aren't just released without any consideration. Reports like the one you see here can be quite misinformed and give the impression that they're set free early and that's it. No justice, no monitoring and no consideration for the public. But before this happens, there's a long process to determine whether they will be released. Whether they're successful can be based on their behaviour in prison, what they plan to do when they're released, a statement from the victim, and medical and psychological assessments. This is the process of how a prisoner is released. So if they have been given a fixed term sentence, this means that they were told a set amount of time they would have to serve in prison. They are automatically halfway through this sentence. If the sentence was 12 months or more, they are released on licence or parole. This means they might have to fulfil certain conditions, like going to a rehabilitation course or a meeting with a probation officer regularly. So you can see that for people who have committed more serious crimes, just because they're released doesn't mean they're free. They face more restrictions and conditions than they would have been before being imprisoned. For people on life sentences, this process is even more rigorous and beyond their control. So it's impossible they will be released without any consideration. The government has to apply for parole on their behalf, and then it goes through the same process as before, with lots of reports and risk assessments. If this is successful, the inmate is released, but that isn't the end of the story. Many of them are in a vulnerable position. They often have very little money, few contacts, and poor employment prospects. The last point, employment prospects, is really important when considering how someone is going to survive outside prison. There's already a lot of stigma around unemployment, as well as around being someone who's been in prison. As I'm sure you can imagine, a lot of employers wouldn't want to hire someone with a criminal record, and not having a job puts a lot of pressure on them, particularly if they have a family or have to support themselves independently. So overall, adjusting back into a community is very difficult. I found it to be isolating and stressful. On top of those points, a higher percentage of offenders are living in poverty compared to those who don't commit crime. This has led a lot of researchers to conclude that poverty might be one of the key motivations for offending. So when you consider that a lot of people enter prison with little money, then are released and realise that getting employment is going to be even more difficult, it's easy to see why some people might choose to re-offend. As well as leaving with not much money, a researcher named Binswanger found that the likelihood of death just after a release from prison increases by about 13 times. This can be from lots of things such as mental health problems and suicide, heart problems and substance abuse. This statistic really just illustrates that the initial period is a dangerous and uncertain time for a lot of people. It certainly was for me. Continuing on from that, there are more practical issues that offenders will face when they leave prison. The first one might be meeting parole conditions. I mentioned that people who are released after a sentence of over 12 months are placed on a licence. They might have to meet with a probation officer regularly or avoid certain areas related to their crime, or a whole range of other conditions. Whilst these are in place for a reason, they can also place stress on someone in an already stressful situation, so this really needs to be managed. Another problem might be avoiding drugs and alcohol, and there are a lot of drug and alcohol problems amongst prisoners, and research has suggested that this needs to be addressed to reduce the risk of reoffending. Sometimes a person's licence conditions will state that they have to attend a drug or alcohol problem, but the dropout rates for these are quite high. This might be because someone slips back into old habits, or they're encouraged by people around them, or maybe they find the pressure of their daily life just too much. Regaining parental rights is a big issue, especially for women. When they enter prison, their children are only cared for by the father in a very small percentage of cases, so usually the child is cared for by a non-immediate family member, or they're taken into care. Getting the child back after that is a really long, difficult process that often isn't successful. Of course, this also applies to men, as many aren't allowed access to their children by family or by social services after they're released. Practical issues like housing and employment also factor in, which adds to the pressure. This can impact on the other factors too, so if they don't have a job or somewhere to live, it's unlikely they'll be allowed contact with their children, and this in turn could lead to more drug and alcohol problems. The last one is stigma from people around them. As I'm sure you can imagine, a lot of people don't want to associate with someone who has been in prison. This is particularly common for more serious offences, like sex offending or violent crimes. And that's understandable. People want to keep themselves safe. But what the stigma can do is isolate an offender. And this can actually lead to more reoffending, which I will come on to in a minute. To illustrate this, I've got some quotes from offenders who were recently released when they were interviewed. As you can see, they're all quite negative. The one on the top left talks about how a lack of social support makes really simple tasks very difficult. Imagine trying to fill out a tax form for the first time with nobody to show you how to do it, or trying to look for housing without a computer. Practical issues and criminal convictions usually work together to put ex-offenders at a huge disadvantage. The one on the top right talks about feeling badly prepared and being left with no real safety net. And the bottom one says that employment is really difficult to find because of these practical things not being available, such as not being able to buy smart clothes for interviews, or having a criminal record that stops employers wanting to hire you. As you can see, he says, "I'm pretty much the bottom of the barrel pick," which shows you that it can also affect your self-esteem. So now that you've seen the difficulties that can be faced, I want to move on to how we can maybe make this a bit better. And one answer is through social support. Some researchers have said that the ideal time to intervene with ex-offenders is when they return to their community. And as a lack of social support is known to be something that can lead to reoffending, this might be one of the things to target. Interviews with offenders have shown that friends, family and general support are really important in whether they go on to commit more crime. Social links can tie you to a community and give you more to lose if you go to prison. They can act as role models, or they can generally give you less opportunity to commit crime. You can see that in the quote I just showed you, where the man stated that he found tasks quite difficult without family and friends. So having people around you can also make practical problems a little bit easier too. So while social support can be good, it can also be bad. Good social support means a good example set by friends or people they know. This has been linked to less criminal behaviour. But the bad social support can mean an offender going back to their old ways. because they're associating with the same criminal element they did before. Ideally, this would be reduced. Bad social support can also look like something like this. In the US, they have Megan's Law. This is a list of sex offenders within a community that can be accessed by anyone. I went onto this website and typed in a random city and could immediately access the names, addresses and criminal records of thousands of people. This has been linked to a whole host of problems. Offenders being harassed, attacked or even committing suicide. The only benefit researchers have found is that the people involved felt like they were being monitored, so they thought they might re-offend less. But there are a lot more negatives. They often end up homeless because they fear their neighbours, and that creates a cycle of stressful living that can drive them back to committing crime. And in any case, monitoring an ex-offender could be much better achieved through social support and having people around you to keep you in check. So what does social support look like? Well, one kind is through agencies like NACRO and Circles. These are charities that try to reduce crime by supporting offenders and ex-offenders. This might be through education or putting them in contact with rehab programs or providing volunteers to act as mentors. A 10-year review of Circles recently showed that ex-offenders who took part in meetings with volunteer mentors were significantly less likely to reoffend. One really important aspect of this kind of social support is that it holds the ex-offender accountable for their crime. This means that they're encouraged to recognise the harm they might have caused, rather than simply being accepted despite what they have done. Research has shown that in areas where crime rates are particularly high, ex-offenders might be accepted despite their crime, but not held accountable. This can be just as unhelpful as no social support, as it provides them with an environment where they're allowed to reoffend and not face any social consequences. So you can see it's a balancing act between reducing stigma, but also ensuring the ex-offender knows that they haven't just got away with it. So we know that the public support of community re-entry is important, and statistics have shown that most people do believe offenders should be given a second chance. However, most of these people also tend to shun ex-offenders and avoid interacting with them. As you can see, this is quite a contradiction. People want rehabilitation to work, but they don't want to be a part of it. Some researchers have also found that the public seem to overemphasise the importance of employment for ex-offenders and ignore other issues like housing or addiction. So that you have some more evidence of how social support could be helpful, I have some research here. Savannah Mittelmark found that offenders rated the following things as important. Out of the 5 of them, 3 of them are directly related to how a community can help. So emotional, practical and social support is the obvious one. Interpersonal skills is also one, because that's something you can build up through interacting with other people. Having employment opportunities could also come under that, because as I mentioned earlier, the stigma faced by offenders when they're released makes finding employment really difficult. If there's a general reduction in that stigma, employment might be a bit easier to find. This is also true for offenders who are mentally ill. Mentally ill offenders make up a huge proportion of people in prisons, so this is really important. There's already quite a stigma around mental health problems, so for those with a criminal record and a mental health diagnosis, that's twice as hard. So for these people, a reduction in stigma would be especially important. This last study here actually directly found that family support can be linked to lower rates of reoffending. This might be because the family provided a deterrent, or they give the offender more to lose if they do reoffend. Either way, it's a positive thing for everyone. And from all this, I hope you can see that community and family support don't just help ex-offenders. It also means less crimes being committed by them. This means less victims too. So overall, you can see that there is a lot of concern about the numbers of ex-offenders in our community. That concern is from the public, in the government and in policies. These ex-offenders face so many difficulties when they're released, like trying to get a job, trying to reconnect with their families, find houses, and so on and so on. and they need social support for this. There are organisations and charities dedicated to this, but obviously they only have a limited number of resources and volunteers. On top of this, whilst the public generally seem to support the idea of community re-entry, they don't want to take part in it themselves. This needs to change. Community acceptance of ex-offenders can reduce reoffending and generally improve community relations. Now, this doesn't necessarily have to be as extreme as giving up your job in order to work with offender rehabilitation, but it might mean reconsidering your attitude towards someone you know who has a criminal record, or not immediately thinking they'd be unsuitable for a job. Little changes can mean a big effect over time. Finally, as people who can vote, you could consider supporting alternatives to prison. Imprisonment itself has not been shown to reduce reoffending, and so it might be time to come up with a better solution. I hope this has helped you understand how important it is to be accepting of ex-offenders in the community. I think small changes to make ex-offenders feel more welcome and accepted can make a huge difference. And you're in a position to make those changes. So I really hope that you do. Thank you all for listening, and I hope this has helped you all to understand this difficult process more.